Yeah, Charles, we were just chatting before we went live. You were listening to my conversation with Chloe Carmichael about censorship and freedom of speech being a mental issue rather than a political issue. I found that a really refreshing angle.
Yeah, so did I. I think the way I look at it is that it's the sort of macro part of dealing with emotions of any sort. The idea that if somebody's got a problem, they do need to talk about it. They need to get it off their chest, and it goes back to that so often seen pattern of people having a fallout or having a disagreement simply because one person has not allowed the other to talk. They're immediately trying to sort of fight fire with fire, where actually what should be done is a process of listening. If somebody brings an issue, they've got to be able to get the whole thing out. That is in itself a sort of cathartic process, and it almost doesn't matter what the other person says in response to a certain extent. I mean, it does, but in the first instance, it's just being able to get it out, whatever it is, just get that out. And I think what she was talking about, and I would recommend, obviously, all of your Jerm warfare content, but specifically to listen to that, because I think that talks very much to what we're seeing in the space that we occupy. I don't really want to define it any more than that, but in effect, the people who feel that the issues they care about are ones that are affected by what we refer to as censorship. Now, she's talking about censorship, inflicted by another entity, an organization or whatever, or indeed a culture, but also she's talking about self-censorship, and it's this sense that people have that they are trapped because they see a world around them that they can't understand as being right, and they want to be able to talk about it, but they have got to the point where to do so is more and more and more challenging, because equally on the other side, people are being conditioned to think that anybody that disagrees with this, that, and the other, or has questions to ask about whatever it is, shouldn't be countenanced. So in effect, there's self-censorship on both sides, which is really dangerous. And I think this is, we've talked a lot about how things have changed since 2020, and what we've remarked upon quite a lot is the way that there's been a cooling off of the types of actions, the types of sentiments that were invoked in people in 2020 in particular, when it was very, very obvious that there was a massive loss of liberty. And actually to talk about that to anyone was not controversial. That was an easy thing to do, regardless of what they thought of the justification for it. That's become increasingly difficult to do. And I think what we're seeing is not just people falling away from taking on independent alternative news sources or mainstream news sources, but also this sense of isolation and pent-up frustration, for want of a better word. And as Chloe talks about, that leads into depression and everything else. But the unfortunate consequence is that when these things do come out, the way in which they're expressed are often very aggressive and actually counterproductive. And I think we do see an awful lot of that. And I think it's really regrettable. And I'm not saying so in terms of trying to pin blame on people, but I think it helps us to understand why this is happening.
So I haven't heard the interview yet. I'm sorry about that. But what I'm going to, so hopefully I'm not repeating anything here, but I would go a little bit further than what Charles has just said. The censorship regime that we are experiencing at the moment is not just about the establishment attempting to maintain control of narratives. That's part of it. But following on from what Charles has just said, the fact that people who feel that their voices aren't being heard tend to shout louder, it also drives them to extremes of position. And by that, I don't necessarily mean, to the extremes of political thought. I mean that they become so entrenched in their position because they feel they're not being listened to, that it's not possible anymore to have a conversation. And this is part of it as well. So we're seeing a rise of people being driven further and further apart, finding it impossible to communicate with each other in any sensible way. This is part of the effort to keep control of the narrative, in the sense that, of course, if you're not communicating with each other, then you're not reaching conclusions about what's actually going on. It's very insidious exercise here. It is absolutely the use of applied psychology for political purposes. And, you know, whenever we're feeling that, well, this censorship regime is completely unfair, I'm being not able to express myself properly, and my urge then is to shout louder with more extreme language, we're in fact falling into a trap. We've got to absolutely resist calmly and carefully, and be clear in what we're saying, because otherwise, you know, that gulf is never going to be breached.
Her general shtick is more about self-censorship, which is something we often overlook, Mike, because we always talk about, as you say, the censorship regime. It's always a third party. It's somebody else doing the censoring. Self-censorship is a lot. It's similar, but it's in many ways more dangerous, because you don't know when it's happening. That's the problem that she's making, because people, for whatever reason, and this is why she says it's a mental issue or a psychological issue, they become too scared. Let me give you an example. So we had friends over a few nights ago. They were chatting about pregnancy and vaccination, and other people they know who just randomly, you know, died or got sick or something severe. Now, they don't connect any of those dots, right? Now, I find myself thinking, nah, I'm not gonna broach this one, because it's become so sensitive. So that's a form of self-censorship. It frustrates me that I choose not to bring it up, but I don't want to ruin the evening. But 10 years ago, we could have easily spoken about that without ruining the evening.
So what I would say to you is that everybody experiences that. I experience that. I get into a situation with people, and actually they're expressing views that I disagree with so vehemently that I'm sitting thinking, well, how do I actually address this? But if it ends there, if the thought process ends at that point, and you leave that gathering and just don't think about it again, and then the next time you have reached a similar situation, then you failed yourself and you failed the other people. You know, every time, this is just how I approach it. Every time I get into that situation, I'm then thinking about it afterwards. I'm thinking about it quite a lot afterwards. What could I have said? What could I have done in that situation to engage these people in a conversation? And I don't necessarily always come to the right conclusions, because sometimes that results in tricky conversations. But we've got to have these tricky conversations, and so I completely get your point. But we've all found ourselves in these types of situations. The question is, what do we do about it? And we've got to actually work out, you know, continue thinking about it after the actual event, so the next time it happens, you've got something to try. Maybe it doesn't work. But it's like meeting people in the street, though, in a bus queue, or in the waiting for the cashier in the supermarket. Sorry, Charles. Some people still do that. But anyway, you know, the point is, we absolutely have to stop being afraid to engage with people, and you know, be afraid to risk a response, and the response that you get should never be one that you take negatively. It should be one that, okay, so that person's come back at me with that. How do I respond to that? And I may not have an answer at that particular moment in time, but the next time it happens, I will have an answer, because I'll have thought about it. But we got to be always thinking about how we address these issues, and we shouldn't just dismiss them as being, oh, that guy's an idiot, or that woman's an idiot. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be absolutely listening to what they're saying to us, and considering it, and considering our response to it. And that helps us develop our own arguments. It also helps us challenge our own, and we've talked about this before, challenging our own belief systems, because none of us should be so arrogant that we think that we have all the answers.
A point that Chloe was making is the difference between speaking freely and also just being a nice person. Just because you can speak freely, you're not going to run past an old granny on a bus and start swearing at her for no reason, just because you have free speech. I mean, that's just common decency not to do that. But that's the problem that we find ourselves in, is that people are finding that line blurry because, as you say, they're being so propagandized into thinking certain ideological ways that they just cannot think clearly because there's so much fog.
But that applies to us ourselves as well. I mean, the best, possibly the best way to approach it is just to ask questions and
the Socratic method.
Yeah, I suppose you could put it that way, but just ask questions because first of all, I want to know. I can't address what somebody else has said unless I actually know what it is they're saying, and very often I hear words and I think I know what that means, but it's not always the case. To the point that sometimes I do wonder whether the other person's speaking English. But that's actually my problem, not theirs. So I've got to first of all try to understand what is this person actually saying, and that of course is part of the issue. We're all so determined to get our point of view across. We're never actually listening to what the other person's saying, and quite often we actually find we're not so far apart after all.
So what you're saying is people listen to respond rather than listen to understand.
Well, precisely, or they don't listen at all because they just want to ride over the top of somebody else's argument and hope that their argument wins because they shout the loudest or most forcefully. This is never going to result in a good outcome.
And censorship doesn't really work anyway, whether it's top-down imposed or self-censorship, because as Chloe was pointing out, it causes all sorts of other issues, depression, anxiety, whatever, within yourself if you choose not to say something that you otherwise would have.
Yeah, well, I think that's precisely the danger, and well, like I said at the outset, this doesn't have to necessarily have anything to do with controversial topics. This is the same, whatever the issue, whatever is eating somebody up, whether it's well, I think one of the examples she gave was seeing something, or I think you talked about having witnessed something sort of untoward, and what's your moral duty, and this, that, and the other. So, I mean, that's not really an issue of censorship. It's just it's just that feeling that you've got to do what's right, and until you've done that, until you've sort of satisfied your conscience by saying something, then that does have a very destabilizing effect. I think in terms of dealing with people who do appear to have an opinion that is very different, but more than that, they're very sort of deliberate in expressing that and making it clear that there's to be no debate. I mean, I think actually just talking about what we are talking about would be an interesting one. Asking the question about listening to other people, about other points of view, and this, that, and the other, because I think that is something that people really must be able to acknowledge. The way that we've gone in the last 20 years, you've just talked about the conversations that one would be able to have sort of 10 years ago about this, that, and the other. Absolutely. I think people can acknowledge that on both sides, and to talk about it, and again get back to a point of convergence to be able to understand why and what the influences are, I think would be really interesting, and might lead into a sort of softer way of dealing with whatever the actual issue is that you wanted to discuss. And I think, yes, I mean, I would absolutely agree. Asking questions is absolutely the right way to go about it, and especially if it happens to be something that you have, you consider that you have a reasonable amount of knowledge on, because you have actually specifically looked into it. to ask questions in such a way as to demonstrate that you are aware of this, that, and the other. You know, we'll say, what do you think about this particular factor pertaining to this issue? And, you know, I mean, often you'll get to a point where it becomes very clear that actually, despite the strongly held opinion or the incredible conviction from the other party, they won't actually know what it is that you're referring to. And that, again, is a sort of a point of break-in, not to assert your dominance over the conversation, but just to make the point that there is another way of looking at it. And I think that's the first start. I mean, if you're going to go into conversation and imagining that you're going to change somebody's mind 180 degrees in that one go, I think that's incredibly unrealistic, or at least dangerous, actually, because if you can, then what? You know, they jump on the bus home, sit next to somebody else who gives them a different opinion, and that's where they go there. So there are, you know, to a point, you sort of have to have a certain admiration for people who are prepared to stick to what they believe, even in the face of probing and questioning and everything else, because in effect that's sort of how we form strong beliefs. You know, we do believe that we know what we're on about, and it takes a lot to be on the receiving end of that, and to get to the point where you think, okay, yeah, all right, so actually what I thought about this, that, and the other, I know I will have to go away and deal with that. That's quite a, you know, that you have to be humble to quite a degree to be able to go and do that. But absolutely, people should.